It was late September 2016. I was 31 years old at the time. I had just quit a job I'd hated for 5 years and didn't really have a plan for what was next. I needed time alone, away from the noise, away from people, away from everything. A break, just to breathe. I lived in a busy area near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, but I knew I had to get far away if I really wanted the quiet I was looking for. So I searched around online for cheap rentals in remote places and came across a listing that looked almost too perfect. A small off-grid cabin tucked way back in the Allegheny National Forest, surrounded by trees, and best of all, total solitude. The listing had just a few grainy photos and a vague description. Rustic retreat, surrounded by nature, not for the faint of heart. No neighbors for miles. The ad mentioned that the nearest town was about 40 minutes away, and the price was dirt cheap. It was available for long-term stays too. I figured maybe I could stay for a few weeks. The owner's name was Roger. I never met him in person, just a few emails exchanged. He warned me the cabin was very isolated and basic. No plumbing, no electricity. I told him that was fine. That was exactly what I wanted. I packed up my Jeep with clothes, gear, a cooler full of food, propane canisters, a camping stove, lanterns, batteries, and plenty of water. I also brought a rifle just in case I ran into anything dangerous, even though I wasn't planning to hunt. I made the long drive north and arrived in the forest late in the afternoon. The roads got rougher and narrower the deeper I went. The GPS gave up halfway, but Roger had sent step-by-step directions in his last email. I followed them carefully. Eventually, I found the turnoff he mentioned, a barely visible dirt track almost covered in overgrowth. I drove slowly down the path, tree branches scraping the sides of my Jeep, until I finally saw it. The cabin. It was small, made of dark, weathered wood, with a steep tin roof that looked like it had been patched with random pieces of metal over the years. There was a narrow front porch, a rusted metal chair, and a crooked wooden door. Behind it, thick forest in every direction, except for one spot on the left side, where the trees opened up into a wide clearing. That's when I noticed something I hadn't expected. There was a graveyard right next to the cabin. It wasn't huge, maybe 40 or 50 graves, but it was real, old. Most of the headstones were cracked or tilted. Some were so worn you could barely read them. A few had iron fences around them, rusted and broken. Weeds had taken over much of it, and tall grass grew between the rows. A twisted old oak stood at the far end, and its limbs stretched over some of the graves like a claw. I just stood there for a long time, staring at it. I don't know why Roger didn't mention that in the listing. I thought about turning around. I really did. But I was already there, and part of me felt stupid. It was just a bunch of old graves, probably a family plot from the 1800s. Not like anyone was going to bother me. I told myself it didn't matter. I went inside the cabin and looked around. It was dusty but cleaner than I expected. A small wood stove, a narrow cot with a thin mattress, a cracked window, and a heavy trunk against the far wall. That was about it. No signs of mice or bugs, just the smell of old wood and dust. That first night was quiet, cold, but peaceful. I cooked dinner on the stove outside and sat on the porch watching the stars come out. There were so many. It was hard to believe how dark it could get when you were really far away from everything. The graveyard was just a black shape off to the side. I didn't look at it much. I stayed in that cabin for nearly 2 weeks. Most days I explored the woods. I followed deer trails, climbed hills, found small streams. I even found an old collapsed barn about a mile away. Each evening I'd come back, heat food, write in my notebook, and read. I started to feel better, like my head was clearing. But around the 5th or 6th day, I started to notice little things that didn't sit right with me. It started with the graveyard. One morning, just after sunrise, I walked past it to check it out more closely. I brought a thermos of coffee and just wandered between the graves. Some of the headstones dated back to the early 1800s. A few had matching names, probably a family. There were even a couple of children buried there. But the thing that struck me was how fresh some parts of the soil looked. It didn't make sense. The graves were all supposed to be over 100 years old, but a few of them looked like the dirt had been dug up recently. Not all of them, just maybe 3 or 4. I knelt down and touched the dirt on one of them. It was loose, like it hadn't settled. No grass had grown back over it. I tried to tell myself animals had dug into it, maybe raccoons, but it didn't look like that. It looked like someone had dug down and then filled it back in again, carefully. That feeling stayed with me the rest of the day. Couldn't shake it. That night, I kept waking up to noises outside. Not loud, just faint crunching. Leaves, like someone walking slowly. But I never saw anything when I looked out the window. I tried to write it off as deer, but it didn't sound like a 4-legged animal. It sounded like footsteps, like measured. The next day, I walked the edge of the clearing to see if maybe someone else was around. I didn't find tracks, but in the far corner of the graveyard, I saw something new. A small pile of stones, stacked neatly. At first I thought it had always been there, but I was sure it hadn't. The stack was about 2 feet high, balanced carefully, like someone had put effort into making it. Not just random rocks. There were small pieces of wood tied with twine sitting on top. I didn't touch it. I just stared at it and walked away. Later that afternoon, I hiked to a high ridge and got cell signal long enough to check my messages and do a little online searching. I looked up the history of that part of the forest, trying to figure out who might have been buried there. I found a few old articles about homesteaders from the 1800s and logging families, but nothing that really explained the graveyard next to the cabin. It wasn't listed on any of the historic maps I found. That night was worse. I had just fallen asleep when I heard it again. Movement outside, but this time it didn't stop. It sounded like someone walking slowly around the cabin. Dry leaves crunching, then silence, then footsteps again, then something light tapping against the porch railing. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. I waited. I didn't have the nerve to open the door, but I kept the rifle next to me, loaded. Eventually the noises stopped, but I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat there in the dark, lantern off, waiting. The next morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. Right in front of the door on the porch, someone or something had left another pile of stones, just like the one I'd seen in the graveyard, neatly stacked. A small piece of wood on top, wrapped with twine. Except this time, the wood had a symbol carved into it. A circle with a line through it. That was it. I stood there staring at it, frozen. This wasn't some animal. Someone had come in the night, quietly, carefully, right up to my door, and they'd left that for me to see. I didn't even touch it. I packed a day bag, threw it in the Jeep, and drove out of there for the rest of the day. I went into town, got food, sat in a diner, and used the Wi-Fi to look up everything I could about strange symbols, stone piles, anything. Most of what I found was superstitious junk. Folklore. None of it helped. That night, I parked my Jeep facing the cabin, lights on. I stayed up late inside, rifle on my lap. Around 3 a.m., the motion sensor light I'd set up by the window clicked on. I jumped up and looked. There was a figure standing in the clearing. Not close, maybe 30 yards away, near the edge of the graveyard. I couldn't make out details, but it was human, standing perfectly still, just watching the cabin. I didn't move. I just stood there, barely breathing. After a minute or two, they turned slowly and walked into the woods. I left the next morning. I didn't pack most of my things, just grabbed the important stuff and threw it into the Jeep. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. My hands were shaking on the wheel. I didn't calm down until I got home. I emailed Roger and told him I was done. I didn't explain why. About a week later, I got curious and went back to that listing. It was gone, just removed. I've never been back to that part of the forest. Never will. I still don't know who or what was out there. I don't know why someone would dig up those old graves, or why they left those stone piles. But I know this. Something was wrong with that place. And whatever it wasn't just in my head. I saw the figure. I heard the steps. I found those fresh graves and symbols. It was real. I just don't want to know more. And sometimes when I think about that carved symbol, when I picture that pile of stones sitting silently on my porch, I wonder how long they had been watching me before I even noticed. I hadn't seen Marlene in over 3 years by the time I got the call that she passed. The message came through my sister, who somehow still stayed in touch with some of her friends back in Montana. It was a brain aneurysm. Sudden. No real signs. She was 39. We were married for 7 years. Divorced for 6. I didn't expect to feel much when I heard the news, but I did. It settled in my stomach like a cold stone. I guess there was always some part of me that thought we'd eventually talk again. That some future version of us would figure out how to be friends or at least be civil. Instead, she was gone. I hadn't planned to go back to Montana at all, not since we split. But about 2 weeks after the funeral, I got a certified letter in the mail. It was from her lawyer. She'd left me something in her will, nothing major but surprising. Apparently, she still had that old cabin we used to go to out in the Bitterroot Valley, about 40 miles southwest of Missoula. She had fixed it up more after we divorced, and now she left it to me. Full ownership. No conditions. I didn't know how to feel about that. First, I ignored it. I let the envelope sit on my desk for days. Then one night, I sat down and opened a beer and stared at an old picture of the two of us from Glacier National Park. And I just kept thinking, why me? Why now? Maybe guilt pushed me. Maybe it was curiosity. But 3 weeks after getting the letter, I packed up my pickup, threw some gear in the bed, and started driving north from Cheyenne, Wyoming. The cabin was tucked up in the mountains, past a small logging road, surrounded by pines and birch and fields of dry brush that hadn't seen snow in a month. The air was thin up there, still cold even in late April. The last time I had been here was maybe 2017. It still looked the same, almost exactly the same actually, but it felt different. There was a layer of dust on the front porch, and 2 of the steps creaked under my boots when I climbed them. I pushed open the door with my shoulder, and inside was dark, still, and quiet. The cabin only had 2 rooms. One big open space that held a kitchen, a sitting area, and a bed in the corner, and a small bathroom off to the side. Everything smelled like pine wood and cold stone. I left the door open while I aired it out and set down my pack. There were little things I noticed right away. Marlene had kept the same red checkered curtains, but now there was a newer looking electric heater in the corner. A stack of firewood was neatly piled by the old wood-burning stove. There were newer pans in the kitchen rack. A folded quilt on the bed I didn't recognize. She had been using this place regularly even until the end. I could feel it. That night, I didn't do much. I cooked some ramen on a little portable burner and opened a beer. I left the windows cracked. The quiet out there was thick. It's not like city quiet. It's something different. It's the kind of silence that makes your ears hum. I fell asleep early, maybe around 9:30. I had driven for almost 10 hours that day, and my back was stiff. I used the quilt she left behind and tried not to think too hard. I woke up around 3 a.m., not from a nightmare or anything. Just one of those sudden wake-ups when your brain turns on before your body does. I was cold, but that wasn't it. I sat up and looked around the cabin. It was almost completely dark except for a faint glow through the curtain. The moon must have been out. I didn't hear anything at first, but then there was this faint creaking sound, like floorboards but not inside the cabin. I figured it was the porch, old wood, settling, or maybe a deer stepped too close, but I couldn't go back to sleep. My eyes were open wide, and my body felt tense, like something wasn't right. After 10 minutes, I got up, pulled on my boots, and grabbed the flashlight from my pack. I stepped outside onto the porch and swept the beam across the yard. Nothing, just the tall trees, dead grass, and patches of frost still clinging to the shady spots. I stayed out there for maybe 2 minutes, then went back in, shut the door, and locked it out of habit. I didn't usually get nervous in the woods, certainly not out here, but something felt off that night. The next morning, I decided to stay longer. I hadn't planned on more than a night, but something about the place kept me there. It wasn't nostalgia. It wasn't comfort. It was like the cabin was trying to tell me something I hadn't figured out yet. I walked the property that day. Marlene had made some changes. There were a few more trail markers tied to tree trunks, red ribbons that curved around the western edge of the woods. I followed them for about a mile and came to a small clearing where she had built a fire pit out of stones. There was a metal folding chair still there, half sunk into the ground. I sat in it and looked around for a while. It was dead quiet. I noticed something strange on the way back. Scratches on a tree trunk, not animal scratches. Long vertical gouges about chest high, straight and deep like they were made with a knife. 4 in a row. I ran my finger along one, dry and a bit old, but not weathered completely. It gave me a chill. Back at the cabin, I went through some of the drawers and cabinets. Not snooping, just trying to find things like matches or extra candles. In the kitchen drawer, under a pile of old napkins, I found a little notebook. Just a cheap spiral-bound thing. I flipped it open. Inside were short notes, some scribbled dates, and what looked like hiking logs. But then there were parts that felt off. One line said, "He's watching again. Wasn't sure at first." Another entry, "Saw the same tracks this time, but deeper." Then later, "Didn't tell anyone. Don't want to sound crazy." The entries ended in November of last year, 5 months before she passed. I didn't sleep much that night either. Around 2 a.m., I heard something again. This time it wasn't on the porch. It was farther away in the trees. Quick crunch. Then another. Then silence. I sat up, grabbed the flashlight again, and this time I grabbed the small revolver I kept in my bag too. I stepped outside quietly and listened. There was nothing for about a minute. Then, way off to the north, I saw something move between the trees. Not clearly, just the shape of a figure. Tall, maybe a man, but he wasn't carrying a light, and he was too far to make out anything else. I stood there until I couldn't see anything anymore. Then I went back inside. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I decided I had to know more. I drove into Hamilton, the nearest town, and went to the library. I found an old county plat map and looked up the land plots around Marlene's cabin. The neighboring property to the north was owned by some man named Ellis Graber. I'd never heard of him. Looked like he bought the land about 10 years ago and had a trailer up there. Out of curiosity, I asked around in the grocery store and gas station. No one seemed to know much. One older woman at the counter just said, "Yeah, he keeps to himself," and nothing else. I drove back up the mountain late that afternoon, watching the woods closer than I had before. That night, something changed. It was just after midnight when I heard the noise again. This time it was closer, near the firewood pile. I turned off the light in the cabin, stepped over to the window, and peeked through the curtain. There was someone standing out there, not 10 feet from the door, facing it. I couldn't see much. He was in the shadows, but he wasn't moving, just standing still. I stayed at the window for a full minute. My heart was thudding so loud I could feel it in my fingertips. Then the man turned slowly and walked into the trees again. Not hurried, not scared, like he had all the time in the world. In the morning, I found boot prints in the dirt. Big ones, deep tread, work boots probably. They led from the woods to the porch and then back again. But there were no signs of a vehicle.
No ATV.
No tire tracks. I went back inside and sat down with that little notebook. Maybe Marlene hadn't lost her mind. Maybe she really had seen someone watching her. I stayed one more night just to be sure. But this time I set up a tripwire by the edge of the woods with some bells tied to it. Just simple fishing line and old cans. If someone came near, I'd hear it. It was almost 3 a.m. when it rang. Just once. Sharp and fast. I went outside with the revolver, flashlight in the other hand. My mouth was dry. I followed the sound. No one there, but the wire had been pulled. Someone had walked right into it. Whoever it was had left again. Fast. The brush was disturbed. Fresh tracks bent the grass. And I followed them until they curved and disappeared into deeper forest. That was the last straw. I packed up that morning, locked the door behind me, and drove back to Wyoming. I never went back. A month later, I filed paperwork to sell the cabin. I didn't list it publicly, just contacted a private buyer through an agent. A man with a lot of land up that way wanted it for hunting season. I signed it over without a second thought. I still think about Marlene sometimes, why she left it to me, what she might have been trying to warn me about. I don't know if she knew the man. I don't know if he meant to scare her, or worse. I just know that when I stayed there, I saw the same things she must have seen, felt the same fear. There wasn't any ghost in that cabin, just something real and something dangerous. It was October 2019. I had just turned 32 that summer, and I felt more worn out than ever. I'd been working long shifts at the warehouse, nights mostly, and I was starting to feel like a ghost inside my own body. I needed to get away, not just for a day, but for a while. Someplace far from phones, people, work, everything. So, I packed up my old green Jeep, filled a few plastic bins with food, tools, and other things I might need, and brought along my dog. A 6-year-old golden retriever named Max. Max had been with me since he was a puppy. He'd been through a lot. An old breakup, 2 apartment moves, and those long, quiet nights when I came home so tired I could barely take off my shoes. He never left my side. I figured if anyone deserved a break too, it was him. I'd rented a small, off-the-grid cabin up in the mountains near the Idaho-Montana border. A guy I knew from an old hiking forum said his cousin had built it years ago but hadn't been back in a while. No electricity, no cell service, no roads past the last 3 miles. You had to hike the rest in on foot. That sounded perfect to me. We left early on a Friday morning. It was cold and cloudy, with patches of fog sliding between the trees as we climbed deeper into the hills. I parked the Jeep on a narrow gravel shoulder, slung my pack over my back, and grabbed the bin with dry food and supplies. Max trotted beside me, sniffing everything like he was trying to memorize the whole forest. His tail wagged constantly. I didn't realize how much I missed watching him just enjoy the world. The hike to the cabin took about an hour and a half. The trail wasn't marked, but it was visible enough. Fallen pine needles covered most of the ground, making it soft underfoot. The higher we got, the thicker the trees became, like they were closing in around us. I didn't mind it. I wanted to disappear. The cabin itself was exactly what I hoped for. Small, square, and weather-beaten. The front porch sagged in the middle, and the roof had a line of old pine cones stuck in the gutter, but it stood solid. Inside, there was a narrow cot, a table with 1 chair, a wood stove in the corner, and a few shelves with rusted pans and faded cans of beans. A little dusty, a little cold, but nothing I couldn't handle. I unpacked, set up a few LED lanterns, rolled out my sleeping bag, and fed Max. He laid down near the stove like he already knew this place would be ours for a while. That first night was peaceful. I cooked a small dinner on the propane burner, read an old paperback by lantern light, and listened to the wind move through the trees. Max snored a little in his sleep. I felt calm in a way I hadn't for months, but that didn't last. The second night, something woke me up. It was just past 2 in the morning. I knew because I checked my old wristwatch in the dark. Max was up too, not barking. He never barked unless something really set him off. But he was staring at the door, ears up, head tilted slightly. I listened hard. First, nothing, just the breeze outside. Then I heard it. Footsteps on the gravel path leading up to the cabin. They were slow, deliberate, not fast like someone running. One step, then another, then it stopped. I sat frozen in my sleeping bag. Max didn't growl, but he was alert, his head low like he was ready to move. I didn't own a gun. I had a camping axe, a large knife, and a thick flashlight with metal casing. I reached for that last one and kept it beside me. I waited. Nothing happened for the rest of the night. I barely slept. Every sound outside made my heart jump. Branches creaking, something rustling in the leaves, a distant owl. But no more footsteps. By morning, I convinced myself it had to be an animal. A deer, maybe, or some kind of critter that wandered close. The gravel had been shifted a little when I checked it, but it was hard to say what made the marks. There weren't any clear prints. Max sniffed around but didn't act concerned. I figured I was just overthinking. Still, I started keeping my axe closer, just in case. The next few days, nothing happened. Max and I explored the woods nearby, stuck close to the cabin, and collected fallen wood for the stove. I made notes in a little journal I brought. I didn't hear or see anything strange again until the 5th night. It was colder that evening. I had the stove going full and layered up in a wool shirt and thermal pants. Max curled up tight. I'd started to feel safe again, even though something about that night kept me on edge. Around 11 p.m., I heard the back window creak. It was slight, like someone gently pushed on the wood frame. Then I heard it again, this time more pressure, like weight shifting against the outside wall. Max stood up and walked slowly toward the back of the cabin. I followed him, flashlight in hand. I waited a few seconds, then swung open the rear door and shined the beam out. Nothing, just trees and shadow. But the smell hit me. It was faint but sharp. Sweat, maybe, or old clothes soaked in damp air. It was the smell of a human. I turned the light around, checking the brush, the trees. Still nothing. I kept Max close the rest of the night. In the morning, I noticed something that made my stomach sink. There was a cigarette but near the back wall. Old but not ancient. The filter was still mostly white. Someone had been here, and that someone didn't leave in a hurry. I buried it under some rocks without thinking. I felt watched after that. Not constantly, but like something sat just outside the reach of vision. Always quiet, always waiting. I couldn't explain it, and I didn't tell myself stories. I just paid more attention. I started locking the cabin door with a makeshift bolt I rigged using rope and an iron hook from one of the shelf brackets. It wouldn't stop anyone determined, but it might slow them down. Every night, I kept the fire going low, stayed quiet, and watched. Max never barked, but he didn't sleep deeply anymore. He listened like I did. Then came the last night. It was raining. Light, steady rain that tapped on the roof like a ticking clock. I packed my things already, planned to leave at dawn. I felt tight inside, like I was holding my breath and couldn't exhale until I got out of the woods. At around 3 a.m., Max stood up and growled. Not loud, just a low rumble deep in his throat. He faced the front door. I sat up and grabbed the flashlight. I didn't turn it on yet. Then I heard it. Something scraped across the wooden porch. Not claws, Not paws, something hard, like boots. Max's growl got deeper. Then the door creaked just slightly, enough for me to see the rope I tied shift, tug, then go still again. I turned the flashlight on and stepped toward the door slowly, heart pounding in my chest like a drum. I didn't open it. I aimed the beam through the side window. For a second, I thought I saw a shadow just at the edge of the porch, a shape standing still. Then it was gone. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. At first light, I opened the door and stepped outside with Max. Everything was damp. No real footprints, just mud and wet leaves. But the rope had been cut. Not torn, not pulled apart. Cut clean with something sharp. We left right after that. The hike back felt longer than before. I checked over my shoulder more times than I can count. Max stayed close, and I kept one hand on the axe the entire way. When we got to the Jeep, I almost broke down just seeing it. I drove straight into town, stopped at a gas station, and sat in the car for 10 minutes before I could move again. I didn't tell the police. What would I say? That someone walked near a cabin in the woods? That I heard footsteps? I never went back to that place. I think someone knew I was up there. Maybe they'd been watching. Maybe they were just passing through. I don't know. But it wasn't a ghost or a story, it was a real person. And that's what scared me the most. Real people don't always need a reason. I was 32 when I got the seasonal ranger job up north in Montana, near a small town called Grant Hollow. It was one of those little forest towns with only one gas station, a diner that closed by 6, and more logging trucks than people. I took the job mostly because I wanted a break from people. My last job had me in a concrete office in Minneapolis, staring at spreadsheets and emails for 9 hours a day. I was burnt out and tired, and being surrounded by trees and mountains sounded like a decent escape. The ranger station was a 40-minute drive from the town. My assigned post was even more remote, a small wooden cabin inside Ravenfield National Park, about a mile from the trailhead. The park had been closed for the past 2 years because of landslide risks, but they reopened a few parts in spring. I was hired to patrol the reopening areas, check for wildlife hazards, maintain signs, and report back to the central station weekly. My assigned cabin was originally a fire watch outpost, built in the late 70s. I was told most rangers didn't use it anymore because it was too isolated and falling apart, but I liked that. I didn't want to share bunkhouses or hear radios going off all night. My first week was quiet. The days were long but easy. I'd wake up early, log the weather readings, hike the perimeter trails, fix broken fences, pick up trash, and record any animal sightings. I rarely saw anyone out there, maybe a few hikers early in the week, but the trails were still marked limited access. So it was mostly just me in the woods. At night, I'd sit on the small back deck of the cabin, sip bad instant coffee, and watch the light fade behind the peaks. I'd fall asleep to the sound of wind through trees, occasionally broken by an elk call or distant coyote. The cabin itself was rough. The front porch sagged, and one of the steps had split down the middle. The windows were covered in permanent grime. Inside, there was a single metal bed frame, a wooden desk, a propane heater that clicked constantly when turned on, and a rusted sink that dripped even when the faucet was off. There was no running water. I had to bring in my own jugs from the refill station near the Ranger HQ. No electricity either, just a lantern and a wind-up flashlight. It was simple, but that was fine. By the second week, I started noticing odd things. Nothing major at first, just little stuff that didn't line up. Like the trail markers I fixed one day were torn down the next, or small rocks stacked near the back of the cabin, in patterns that didn't seem random. I assumed it was kids sneaking out to mess around, or maybe another ranger passing through, but I never saw anyone. And I checked the trail registry at the head every morning, no new entries. Then one night around 10, I was sitting on the back deck. It had been an unusually warm day for April. I remember because I was still in a t-shirt after sunset. I heard this sound behind the cabin, like shuffling in the brush, slow, steady steps. I froze, listening. I've heard bears before. I've heard deer too. This wasn't either. It was too quiet to be a bear, too heavy to be a deer. I stood up and walked quietly to the edge of the deck, but I couldn't see anything in the dark. The lantern inside the cabin cast a soft glow through the window, and I could see my own reflection more than the woods beyond. The sound stopped. I waited a minute, then two. Nothing. I went back inside and locked the door, which was something I hadn't done once before that night. I left the lantern on and kept the flashlight near the bed. I didn't sleep well. The next morning, I walked behind the cabin to check. The pine needles were disturbed, but that didn't prove anything. I followed a faint impression through the undergrowth for maybe 50 feet before it just stopped. No tracks, no broken branches. It just ended. I let it go. I chalked it up to a wandering moose or some kind of animal I misjudged in the dark. But something about it stuck with me. Midway through the third week, things escalated. One morning, I woke up and found my cabin door slightly ajar. I never left it like that. I always latched it from the inside. My backpack, which I kept near the desk, was moved. Nothing was missing, but the top zipper was open. My flashlight had been placed neatly on the windowsill. Not dropped, not rolled, placed. That chilled me. That same day, I hiked the North Ridge Trail, the one that loops above a dry ravine. I found fresh boot prints in the dirt, a single set, deep impressions going both ways. I didn't wear that size boot. I followed the tracks a while, but they turned off trail near a thicket and disappeared again. I started to feel watched out there. Not constantly, just moments. I'd be walking and feel this weight behind me, like eyes tracking from the tree line. I'd stop, turn, and see nothing. But the air would feel heavier, more still.
No Birson, no Rustle.
The isolation I once enjoyed began to turn against me. I found myself jumping at small sounds at night, cracking branches, snapping twigs. I kept the lantern on longer. I stopped going to the back deck. I double-checked the cabin door each night. One afternoon, I returned from a long patrol and found something I still don't fully understand. On the desk inside the cabin, there was a photo, a printed Polaroid-style picture, just lying there. It showed the outside of the cabin, taken from a low angle, maybe 20 feet out. And in the photo, in the window, was my face. I was inside when it was taken. That picture hadn't been there when I left that morning. I know that for certain. I felt sick. My knees went weak. I stood there staring at it for a long time. I checked everything inside the cabin. Nothing else was out of place. No signs of forced entry. No damage. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside, watching, close. I radioed the station and said I'd be coming in that weekend instead of waiting till Monday. I didn't say why, just said I needed to check something in town. I spent that night with my back against the wall, flashlight in my lap, and a hiking knife I usually kept sheathed under my pillow. I planned to pack up the next morning and hike back to the station. But when I woke up, my boots were gone. I placed them by the door like always. They were just gone. I searched everywhere, even outside.
No trace.
No footprints, no sign of animal interference. I was stuck. I had backup shoes in my pack, but they were light trail runners, not meant for rocky terrain or steep climbs. I put them on anyway. I had to get out. That hike was the worst I'd ever done. I felt exposed with every step, like someone was following just out of sight. I kept looking behind me, checking ridgelines, staring into the trees. I kept the knife in my hand the whole time. Took me nearly 6 hours to reach the Ranger HQ. When I got there, I didn't go inside right away. I sat on the porch, heart pounding, trying to calm myself. I didn't want to sound insane. Eventually, I went in and gave a simple report. Said I thought some kids were messing around near the old cabin, maybe squatting or trying to scare off rangers. I left out the photo. They took it seriously enough. That section of the park was put under restricted access again due to trail erosion. I wasn't sent back there. I spent the rest of the season assigned to more central areas, closer to town, closer to people. About 2 weeks before my contract ended, I went into the small records office to log some paperwork. The head ranger had an old file cabinet full of printed incident reports from decades past. I flipped through a few while waiting for my turn to use the printer. One folder caught my eye. The label said, Ravenfield Cabin 1996 to 2003. Inside were half a dozen reports. Most were short, minor break-ins, items moved. One ranger found all his maps shredded in the night. Another reported seeing a man standing in the woods just watching from a distance. One report stood out. It was dated October 2001. The ranger had written, I think someone lives out there, not in a house, just lives, hides, watches, doesn't want to be found. None of those reports ever led to arrests.
No suspects.
No investigations beyond short follow-ups. I didn't renew my contract. It's been 4 years since then. I haven't gone back to Montana. Sometimes I still think about that photo, about how I was inside the cabin, unaware, and someone was right outside the whole time, taking my picture. I never found the boots. I never found out who was out there. But I know someone was, and I wasn't supposed to stay in that cabin. Not for that long. Not alone. It was early fall in 2013 when I decided to take some time off and get away from everything. I was 32 then, living alone in a small apartment in western Pennsylvania. My job in logistics had worn me down. Day in and day out stuck in a cluttered office full of people who barely looked up from their screens. I was tired of city noise, the tight spaces, the fast pace, and more than anything, I needed quiet. Real quiet. Not the kind with cars humming in the distance or dogs barking in alleys. I wanted to wake up to nothing but the wind in the trees and the rustle of dry leaves under my boots. A coworker of mine, Ian, had an uncle who owned a farm out near the West Virginia border. He told me his uncle had passed away a couple of years earlier, and the land was just sitting there, untouched. There was a small, weathered cabin in the far corner of the property, behind the main farmhouse and across a long stretch of pasture. Ian said it was simple, quiet, had no internet or running water, but it was solid and private. That's exactly what I was looking for. I packed everything I thought I'd need: non-perishable food, a propane stove, jugs of water, a thick sleeping bag, warm clothes, batteries, a flashlight, a map, and a hunting knife I never really used but brought along anyway. I tossed it all in the back of my old Tacoma and drove 4 hours south into the rolling hills and thick woods near a place called Greenville. The closer I got, the fewer houses I saw. Cell reception dropped to 0, just past a faded sign that looked like it hadn't been touched in a decade. I turned onto a narrow gravel path lined with leaning wooden fences and tall, dry grass. I followed the drive until I reached the old farm. The place looked frozen in time. The main house had peeling paint, shattered windows, and a front porch sagging at the middle like it had taken one too many winters. To the right of it stood a collapsed barn, half covered by weeds. There were rusted tools lying in the tall grass, broken fencing, and what looked like the shell of an old tractor by the tree line. It was obvious no one had stepped foot on the property for a while. I parked off to the side and took a deep breath, watching dust swirl in the air. I didn't plan on staying in the farmhouse. It looked like it could cave in if I sneezed. The cabin, according to Ian, was further back on the land, past the far field and through a narrow path. I left the truck and hiked the rest of the way on foot, hauling a backpack and a duffel full of gear. The cabin sat at the edge of the forest, partially hidden by a few large trees and overgrown brush. It was built from dark, heavy logs, with a tin roof that had gone red with rust. One of the shutters hung crooked, and a few boards near the base were warped from water damage, but it looked sturdy enough. It had a little porch with an old rocking chair, its arms worn smooth from use. I pushed open the creaky door and stepped inside. It smelled like dry wood, dust, and something faintly earthy, like old leaves or mold. The inside was one room, a small bed frame in one corner, a wood-burning stove, a narrow table, and two mismatched chairs. There were shelves on the back wall with jars of who knows what. Most were empty, but a few still had cloudy liquids sealed in them. A rusty axe leaned in the corner by the stove, and a bunch of old tools hung from hooks along one wall. Despite the smell and dust, it felt strangely peaceful. I cleaned it out the best I could, shook out the old blankets, and set up my gear. That first night, I cooked a can of chili on the propane stove, cracked open a beer, and sat on the porch watching the sun drop behind the trees. It was dead quiet except for crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. I slept better than I had in months, but that didn't last. By the third night, things started to feel off. It wasn't something I could explain right away, just little things. I kept feeling like I was being watched. That's not unusual when you're alone in the woods, especially at night, but this felt different. I wasn't spooked by the dark. I liked it, actually, but whenever I stepped outside after sundown, I got this tight feeling in my gut, like something was just out of sight, waiting. One night, I was sitting on the porch after dinner when I heard something in the woods. It wasn't an animal rustling or whine through the trees. It was a thump, like something heavy hitting the ground once. I froze and listened, heart beating faster. A minute passed, then another. Nothing. I stood up slowly and shone my flashlight toward the trees, but the beam didn't reach far enough. Just black trunks and shadows. I waited for a while, then went back inside and locked the door. The next morning, I decided to take a better look around the woods near the cabin. Maybe it was a tree limb falling or a deer. I walked the perimeter, boots crunching through dead leaves. I found old footprints. Some looked like mine, but there were others too. Faint, old ones. Boot prints, deep and wide, heading toward the cabin and circling it in places. I wasn't sure if they were from Ian's uncle or someone else. They could have been years old, for all I knew. I let it go. That night, I heard the thump again. Same sound, same spot, just beyond the trees on the left side of the cabin. I looked out the window, flashlight ready, and saw nothing. This time, though, the feeling didn't go away. Couldn't relax. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, holding the knife next to me like a kid afraid of monsters under the bed. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I noticed something had changed. The rocking chair on the porch, it had moved. I was sure of it. The night before, I'd pushed it to the side, away from the door. Now it was centered again, facing straight out. I stood there staring at it for a long time. Maybe it had shifted from the wind, I told myself. But it hadn't been windy. It was dead calm the night before. I left it where it was and walked the field again. Slower this time. No new prints, nothing fresh. Later that day, I went to check out the old farmhouse. I hadn't stepped inside yet. The front door was stuck, so I had to go around and climb through the back window. The air inside was dry and thick with dust. Old furniture sat covered in sheets, and rat droppings covered the floor. I walked from room to room, looking for signs that someone had been squatting there, but found nothing recent. Just yellowed newspapers from the late 90s, piles of junk, and faded photos in cracked frames. In the upstairs bedroom, I found a box of notebooks in a closet. Most were old farm records, expenses, equipment repairs, but one caught my eye. It was a journal scribbled in pencil with dates from 2011. It belonged to Ian's uncle, Richard. Most of it was boring, weather notes, planting schedules, small repairs, but some entries were strange. Asterisk, something is walking the fields again at night. I thought it was a coyote, but the dogs won't go near the woods anymore. Asterisk, asterisk. Last night, I heard it knock, just once. Didn't open the door. Asterisk, asterisk, third night in a row now. It waits until after midnight. Just one knock, like it's checking. Asterisk, I read through a dozen pages like that. Short, paranoid entries. One line read, asterisk, if it gets in, it won't leave. Asterisk, another said, asterisk, I nailed the shutter shut. Didn't help. Asterisk, I put the journal down and left the house. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Around 1 a.m., I heard something again. This time, it was closer. It wasn't a thump. It was footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching through the gravel path that led up to the porch. I held my breath, knife in hand, and didn't move. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. I didn't look, couldn't. I just waited. Then I heard the rocking chair creak once. Then again. Then silence. I sat there in the dark until sunrise. When I finally stepped out the next morning, the chair was still. But something had changed again. There were boot prints, fresh ones, clear as day in the dirt just off the porch. Wide prints, deeper than mine. I followed them a few feet before they vanished into the grass. My stomach dropped. I packed my gear in under 10 minutes. I didn't care about the peace and quiet anymore. I didn't care if I was overreacting. I threw my bags in the truck, heart pounding the whole time. When I got to the gravel road, I looked back once. Just once. The cabin looked the same. Still, silent. But the rocking chair was moving. Not fast. Just a slow, steady creak. I never went back. Ian didn't ask questions, and I never offered answers. I never told him about the prints or the journal or the noise at night. I kept that to myself. A few months later, I looked up property records for that farm. Turns out Richard hadn't died peacefully in his sleep like Ian believed. The police report said his body had been found inside the main house, dead of exposure. The furnace hadn't been lit, and the door had been nailed shut. From the inside, he'd barricaded himself in. I think about that sometimes, about what he was afraid of, what I heard out there, what might still be on that land. I don't believe in ghosts. I never have. But I believe in fear. I believe something or someone was out there, and I believe I was lucky to leave when I did. I was 32 when I decided to take a break from everything. It was late October 2019, and I had just quit a job I hated in Omaha. I wasn't fired or forced out. I just reached a point where I didn't want to sit behind a desk for another second.
No plan, no backup.
I just walked out one Friday evening and never went back. I had saved some money, not a lot, but enough to survive for a few months if I stayed frugal. I needed quiet, away from people, traffic, screens. I needed the kind of silence you can only find out in the woods. A friend of mine from college had mentioned an old family property somewhere up in northern Idaho, a tiny, off-the-map town called Ridgway, near the base of a mountain range. She said her family used to have a summer cabin up there, but no one had been there in more than 15 years. I got the impression they just didn't care about it anymore. It wasn't up for sale or listed anywhere, just sitting there, rotting into the woods. She gave me rough directions and told me if I could find it, I could stay there as long as I wanted. Took me 2 days to drive there. Once I got past the last gas station an hour south of Ridgway, I didn't see another car. The forest got thicker, darker, and the paved road turned into gravel. I passed some old mailboxes on leaning posts, but there weren't any houses in sight. Eventually, I reached a rusty green gate wrapped in a tangle of blackberry vines. The metal was cold to the touch, and the chain holding it closed had already been cut. I pushed it open and drove my truck another half-mile into the woods until the path got too narrow. I left the truck, strapped on my hiking pack, and walked the rest of the way in. The trail was mostly overgrown. Fallen branches and pine needles covered everything. The ground had a soft give to it. After maybe 30 minutes of walking, I saw it. The cabin stood crooked on a shallow slope, surrounded by thick trees and tall brown grass. Its wood was grayed out from the sun and rain, and the roof sagged in the middle like a tired back. A boarded-up window had been broken at the corner, and one shutter was missing. Still, it hadn't collapsed. I figured if it had lasted this long, it would last a bit longer. There was no path to the front steps anymore. I pushed through knee-high weeds, watching for nails or glass. The door was swollen from moisture and stuck tight, so I had to force it open with my shoulder. Inside, the air smelled like damp wood, mold, and something older I couldn't place. The place had 2 small rooms, one main area with a stone fireplace, a couple broken chairs, and a bare kitchen counter. The other was a bedroom, if you could call it that. The floor was warped. The walls were stained with water damage. But I didn't care. I was alone. The wind moved through the trees, and I could hear it, unfiltered, not mixed with sirens or traffic, just wind. I swept out the floor, hung a tarp over the broken window, and set up my sleeping bag in the main room. I used a camping stove to make coffee, set my flashlight on a stack of books I found in a corner, and read until the sun went down. The first night was peaceful, quiet, cold, but peaceful. The next few days I settled into a slow rhythm. I spent the mornings chopping dead branches for firewood and cleaning out the interior. There were old things in the cabinets, cracked dishes, rusted cans, a can opener with a bent gear. I tossed most of it out the back door. I walked the forest in the afternoons, marking trees with orange tape so I wouldn't get lost. The 4th night was when I started noticing things. It began with little sounds. A thump against the far wall when I was lying in my bag. Something soft, like a hand brushing the outer logs. No wind that night. No animals either. The woods were dead quiet. I told myself the cabin was just creaking. Old wood shifts when temperatures drop. The 5th night I heard footsteps. I know what raccoons and squirrels sound like on a roof, and this wasn't that. These were slow, heavy, deliberate steps on the porch. Then a pause. Then one soft creak, like someone pressing down gently. I sat up, heart beating in my ears. I didn't have a weapon, just a small hatchet. I didn't move, didn't breathe. After a long silence, I finally stood and peeked through the tarp-covered window. No one. The ground was wet from a drizzle earlier that evening. I figured there'd be prints, but there were none. The next morning I looked again. Still nothing. I told myself it was an animal. Maybe a bear. Maybe just my nerves. I was tired. I hadn't spoken to another human in a week. That afternoon I walked farther into the woods than I had before. I found an old water tank half sunk into the earth, rusted through. Then I found something stranger. About 50 yards past the tank, there was a second structure. A shed, smaller than the cabin, nearly buried in brush. The door was gone, just leaning against the frame. Inside, there were old tools scattered across the floor. A hammer, a handsaw with a broken blade, coils of wire, and a pile of thick wooden boards. And in the center was a small hole in the dirt, like someone had started digging something but gave up. Fresh, damp earth. No weeds growing inside it yet. Looked maybe 2 feet deep, 2 feet wide. I walked back to the cabin uneasy. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay still in the dark and listened. Around midnight, I heard it again. Soft footsteps outside, this time circling the cabin. There was no doubt. Someone was walking around out there. I didn't move. I didn't shine my flashlight. I just lay there frozen, listening. Eventually the sound faded. I didn't sleep a second. The next morning, I checked the ground. Still no prints. I walked around the cabin twice. The soil was soft. I should have seen something, but there was nothing. I even pressed my own foot down just to make sure. It left a clear mark. Something wasn't adding up. I walked back to the shed. The hole was deeper now. A fresh layer of dirt stacked beside it. Maybe 4 feet deep now. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't even told anyone I found it. I walked back to the cabin slower than usual, glancing behind me every few steps. The forest didn't feel empty anymore. That evening, I started boarding up the windows with the leftover wood from the shed. I stacked my firewood in front of the door and slept with the hatchet under my blanket. It rained hard that night. I thought the noise might drown out the sounds. But at 3 a.m., I heard the nails. Not a sound I expected. A slow, metallic sound of nails being pulled. From outside, from the back of the cabin. I froze, one by one. Creak, ping, wood shifting, like someone was working the back panel off. I didn't move. I didn't even turn on the light. Just held the hatchet and waited. The sound went on for maybe 5 minutes. Then silence. I stayed awake until daylight. When I stepped outside that morning, the back panel near the base of the wall had been pulled open, clean like a crowbar had done it. The nails were lying in the dirt beside it. Someone had gotten under the cabin. The ground under there was just dirt and dry leaves. I crouched and looked in. Nothing, but something had been there. I could see disturbed earth. A shallow trail. I didn't wait around. I packed everything, stuffed my bag, grabbed my stove and tarp, and hiked fast back to the truck. The gate was still open. The truck was untouched. I drove without stopping until I reached the first town with cell service, pulled into a gas station, and called my friend. I asked her again about the cabin. I didn't mention everything, just asked if anyone else in her family might have been up there. She said no. Her grandfather had built that place in the early 70s, used it for hunting, then died in the 90s. After that, nobody touched it. I pressed more. Eventually, she told me something strange. In 2001, someone broke into the cabin. Her uncle went up to check on it that summer and found the place trashed. He figured it was teenagers or squatters. But when they looked closer, they found holes dug under the floorboards. Small ones. No real damage, just disturbed dirt. Almost like someone had been looking for something. They never figured out who did it. That was the last time anyone in their family went there. She laughed it off. I didn't. I never told her about the sound of nails being pulled from inside the wall. I didn't tell her about the shed or the hole that kept growing each day. I never said anything again. I drove straight home, found a small apartment in Boise, got a quiet job at a bookstore. I haven't gone into the woods since, but sometimes, when I'm alone and it's really quiet, I think about that night. The way the sound of nails echoed through the wall, soft and slow like someone wasn't in a hurry. I don't think they were after me. I think they were just finishing what they started 20 years ago. And I think if I'd stayed one more night, I would have found out what was buried under the floorboards the hard way. It was the fall of 2016 when I decided to get away for a while. I had been working construction jobs around Louisville for almost 10 years, and that year had been the most draining of them all. Long hours, short tempers, and the same gray cement and metal every day. I wasn't burned out exactly, but I felt heavy inside my head. I needed something quieter, something that didn't smell like asphalt or rebar. My cousin had a small piece of land out in northern Arkansas, near a place called Hardy. Not much around there, some hills, a lot of trees, and 2 or 3 small lakes spread out over the area. He had a hunting cabin on one of the hills, tucked into the woods about a half-mile off a gravel road. It wasn't much, just a square wooden box with a roof and a wood stove, but it had a bed and a locked door. That was good enough for me. He told me I could use it for as long as I wanted. I figured I'd stay 4 or 5 days. I packed up my old green Ford with a cooler, some dry food, a gas can, my .22 rifle just in case, and enough clothes to get through the week. I left early on a Monday morning and made the drive in about 6 hours, not stopping much. By the time I pulled off the gravel road and followed the narrow dirt trail back through the trees, it was late afternoon. That golden hour light was cutting through the woods, making everything quiet in a way you could feel. The cabin was just like I remembered it from when I'd seen it once years before. Single room, small front porch, tin roof. There was a rusted axe leaning against the porch rail, and the door had 3 deadbolts on it, which felt like overkill, but I appreciated it. Inside was simple: a cot, a table with 2 chairs, a metal wood stove, and a stack of split logs in the corner. No electricity. I had brought a lantern and a couple flashlights for that. After bringing my stuff in and getting settled, I sat out on the porch with a beer and listened to the woods settle around me. No cars, no people, just the creaking of the trees and the occasional call of a bird somewhere off in the brush. I hadn't felt that kind of quiet in years. That first night was peaceful, cold, but not too cold. I made some ramen, read a little with the lantern light, and fell asleep to the sound of wind moving through the trees. The second day was the same, peaceful. I took the .22 out and walked a few trails. Spotted a couple deer but didn't shoot. I wasn't hunting for meat. I just liked the walk. I cooked some canned chili for dinner and watched the sky darken through the trees. After the sun went down, it got quiet again. Really quiet. I noticed it more than I had the night before.
No crickets.
No wind, just stillness. Felt like the whole forest was holding its breath. I brushed it off, probably just my mind overthinking. It was the 3rd day when things started feeling wrong. That morning, I stepped out onto the porch with my coffee and looked down the slope. The forest spread out in front of me, thick and dark green. And down there, about 50 or 60 yards off, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. A narrow trail, maybe the width of a boot, that hadn't been worn in the day before. It looked fresh. You can tell when a trail's been walked recently. Leaves pushed aside, dirt still soft. At first, I thought maybe it was a deer path. But deer don't walk in straight lines, not like that. This was a clean, deliberate line heading deeper into the woods, to the left of where I'd hiked before. I finished my coffee and decided I'd follow it, just to see. I put on my boots, grabbed the rifle, not because I felt unsafe, just habit, and started down the slope toward the trail. The sun was up by then, and the light through the trees was strong. The trail wound gently to the west, deeper into the woods. It wasn't long, maybe a couple 100 yards, and it ended at a small clearing. There was nothing in it, just a wide patch of dead grass surrounded by trees. What caught my eye was what was on the trees. Carvings. At least 6 of the trees had marks on them. Not words, not initials, just deep cuts, like someone had taken a knife and sliced into the bark in long X-shaped patterns. All at shoulder height, all facing inward, toward the clearing. It looked deliberate, ritualistic almost. I didn't stay long. I backed out slowly and walked back to the cabin. Something about it unsettled me. I've spent time in the woods before. There's always weird stuff. Old beer cans, busted deer blinds, sometimes even junk from hunters or campers. But this felt different. It felt like someone wanted those marks there, like it meant something. That night, I locked all 3 deadbolts and kept the rifle within reach of the bed. I didn't sleep easy. Every creak of the trees outside sounded closer than it should have. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I heard something shuffle through the brush outside. Not fast, just slow, steady movement. I didn't get up. I just lay still, listening. It moved past, and after a while, the forest was quiet again. The next morning, I stepped outside and checked the area around the porch.
No prints.
No broken branches. just the same leaf-covered ground. But when I looked off toward the clearing, something stood out. One of the trees, closer this time, maybe 30 yards from the cabin, had a fresh X carved into it. It hadn't been there the day before. I was sure of it. That day, I didn't go hiking. I didn't leave the cabin. I sat inside, reading, checking the windows, thinking about how far I was from any real road. I had no cell service, no way to call out. I had a car, sure, but the trail it was parked on was narrow and full of bends. If something happened, I'd have to run through thick woods just to reach the gravel road. By that evening, I had started to feel trapped. I built a fire in the stove, more for the comfort of the light than for heat. I didn't eat much. I kept the lantern low and tried to stay awake as long as I could. Around midnight, I heard it again. The slow movement through the brush. This time, closer. There was a scraping sound, light, almost like someone dragging a stick across bark. Came from behind the cabin. Then silence. Then footsteps. I sat up and pointed the rifle at the door. I knew it was probably nothing. Maybe just a raccoon. Maybe a deer. But it didn't feel like that. The footsteps stopped. I sat there for what felt like an hour, not moving, barely breathing. Nothing happened. Eventually, I dozed off with the rifle across my chest. In the morning, I stepped out slowly, looking around. And there it was again, another carving, this time on the porch post. Not deep, just shallow cuts in the wood. But it was the same X shape. Something had been on the porch while I was sleeping. I packed that morning. I was done. I didn't care if I was cutting my trip short. I threw my stuff in the truck, didn't bother eating, didn't bother checking the trail again. I just wanted out. The truck started up fine, and I backed down the trail carefully, trying not to get stuck. The dirt was soft from a little rain the night before, but I made it back to the gravel road. That's when I saw the man. He was standing in the trees, maybe 15 feet off the road, dressed in dark brown coveralls. His hair was long and tangled, his face half hidden by the shadows. He wasn't doing anything, just standing, watching. I didn't stop. I drove past, didn't look back, didn't slow down until I was halfway to the highway. Even then, my hands were shaking. I didn't tell anyone about it when I got back. What was there to say? A few carved trees, a man standing in the woods. No proof. Nothing illegal, but something about it stuck with me. 2 weeks later, I called my cousin and asked him if he'd been up to the cabin recently. He said no, not since I'd left. I asked him if anyone else ever went out there. He said no, it was too remote. He had stopped hunting a while ago and figured no one else would bother. He sounded surprised when I asked if he'd ever seen carvings on the trees. I didn't press it. I just told him thanks again and hung up. I haven't been back to Arkansas since, and I still think about that man in the woods. Not because he chased me or threatened me, not because he tried to break in, but because he didn't. He watched, he waited, he carved something on my porch, and I don't know why. That's the part that gets me. I was 37 when I went up to that cabin in northern Colorado. I'd gotten the keys from a buddy I used to serve with in the Army, Nate, who now lived down in Texas. He'd bought the place years ago with his cousin, but hadn't used it much in recent years. When I told him I wanted to spend some time alone, get away for a while, maybe do some hunting, he offered me the cabin. No charge, just keep it locked, keep the stove dry, and don't forget the propane line valve out back. I drove up on a Thursday morning, mid-October. The weather had just started to turn. One of those weeks where the sun still came through, but the air had bite. The cabin was up near Route National Forest, about 4 miles off the main road, down a tight gravel trail that snaked through tall lodgepole pines. My old GMC Sierra didn't have any trouble getting up there, even with the tires a little worn. There wasn't another cabin for at least 2 miles in either direction. Exactly what I needed. The cabin itself was simple. One room, wooden walls, and a tin roof, no insulation, just a wood stove, a beat-up old bed with a sunken mattress, and a table with 2 chairs. There was no running water, just a steel hand pump outside. No electricity either. That was fine. I brought 2 coolers packed with meat, beer, and eggs, along with a camp stove and a small generator in case I really needed it. I got in around 3 in the afternoon. The sun was low, lighting the pine trunks in that deep golden way that makes everything feel quieter than it is. I parked the truck, unloaded my gear, and set up camp inside. I brought in my Remington 700 bolt action and laid it across the hooks on the wall. My plan was to hunt deer, maybe elk if I got lucky, and just enjoy some days off the grid. I had 4 days ahead of me, maybe 5 if the weather held. That first night passed quietly. I cooked dinner, lit a lantern, wrote a little in my notebook, and listened to the wind outside. I'd forgotten how much quieter the woods were without any engine noise. No humming of appliances, no phones buzzing. Just wind, trees, and the occasional snap of branches from deer moving somewhere out of sight. But I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up, not from any sound, but just unsettled. I'd roll over and stare into the darkness for what felt like hours, ears open, listening. It wasn't fear, not at first. More like my brain didn't believe the quiet, like it was waiting for something to break it. The second morning I was up before dawn. I brewed coffee on the stove and headed out with my rifle. I walked west, up through the ridge that curved behind the cabin, looking for signs, tracks, scat, broken brush. I found some prints about 2 miles out. Definitely deer, maybe a buck. I followed them for a while, took up a spot near a clearing and waited. I didn't see anything, but something was off. It wasn't that there weren't any animals. It was that I didn't hear them.
No birds.
No squirrels in the brush.
No rustling.
Just dead silence. I chalked it up to the cold or maybe my imagination running from the silence the night before. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. Around noon I hiked back, heated up some canned chili, and sat outside the cabin watching the trees. That was when I noticed the nail marks. They were on the back of the cabin, low on the wall. Parallel lines, for of them, dug deep into the wood like someone, or something, had dragged their fingers across it hard. At first, I thought it might have been a bear, maybe scratching or trying to tear into the wall. But the marks were low, too low for a full-grown bear, and they weren't wide or spread out like claws. They were narrow, thin, too neat. I didn't think much of it at the time. Maybe it was an old scrape or something Nate forgot to mention. I didn't have cell signal up there anyway, so I couldn't text him and ask. I went back inside and spent the evening cleaning my rifle and trying to read by lantern light. That night, the wind changed. I remember because it shifted directions sharply, blowing from the south all of a sudden. The chimney on the stove whistled like a kettle, and I had to close the flap to keep smoke from coming back inside. I lay in bed listening again. Same as before, eyes open, watching the roof. Around 2 in the morning, I heard a noise outside. It was subtle at first, crunching. Footsteps on the frost-covered dirt. I sat up slowly, grabbed the rifle from the wall, and kept still.
No lights.
No movement, just sound. The steps came closer. Slow, like someone walking heel to toe, careful not to snap a branch. I stayed frozen. The sound stopped right outside the wall by the head of my bed. I swear I could hear breathing. Not loud or deep, but slow, steady. Like someone standing there, just waiting. And then it was gone. No more steps.
No retreating.
Just gone. I waited until the sun came up before I dared to go outside. I circled the cabin, looking for prints. But the ground was dry and hard. If something or someone had walked up to the wall, they left no sign of it. The weirdest part was that I didn't feel panic. Just confusion, tension, like my body knew something wasn't right, but my mind couldn't decide what to do with that information. I skipped hunting that day. I stayed near the cabin, mostly sitting on the porch with my rifle across my lap, trying to make sense of what happened. I thought about leaving. I could have packed up and headed home, but something kept me there. Maybe pride. Maybe I didn't want to tell Nate I bailed after 2 nights. Maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that nothing was actually wrong. That afternoon, I walked down the old trail about a half-mile from the cabin, just trying to clear my head. I found something strange near a clearing by a fallen pine. It was a small pile of rocks, stacked deliberately, about 8 inches high. In the middle of it was a broken deer antler. Just one side.
No skull.
No blood. Just the antler sitting upright in the rocks like a marker. It didn't make sense. The whole thing looked fresh. The antler wasn't weathered. There were still bits of velvet stuck to it. Something had put it there recently. I backed away and went straight back to the cabin. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I left the lantern off and sat in a chair facing the door with my rifle ready. Around 3 in the morning, I heard the same steps again. This time, slower, almost dragging. They circled the cabin once. Just a slow, deliberate lap. Not fast, not hurried. No banging, no voice. Just someone walking around me in the dark. And then the scratching started. Came from the far side, the back wall, same place I'd seen those old marks. It sounded like someone dragging a nail across the wood. Not violently, almost gently, back and forth, like they were tracing something. I stepped out with the rifle, heart thudding so hard it was making my ears ring. I went around the cabin, swinging the rifle in every direction. But there was nothing, not even wind, just silence. In the morning, I found new marks, same as before, 4 narrow scratches right over the old ones, deeper this time. That's when I knew I couldn't stay another night. I packed everything fast, tossed the coolers in the back of the truck, slammed the tailgate, and drove out without even locking the door. I didn't care anymore. I needed to get out of there. I stopped at a gas station about 30 miles south. There was cell signal, so I called Nate. I told him everything. He didn't say much, but after I finished, there was a long pause. Then he said something I still think about now almost every night. "You know," he said, "my cousin stopped going up there after he found blood near the pump. Never told me what happened. Just gave me the deed and never went back. That was the last time I went hunting alone. Now I keep to public land. I stay near campgrounds. I bring a buddy, and no matter how quiet it gets, I remind myself, sometimes it's not about what's out there, it's about who. Because something or someone was watching me that week, not trying to kill me, not trying to steal anything, just watching, waiting." I was 33 years old when I decided to spend a few quiet weeks in an old hunting cabin my uncle had left behind in his will. It was the fall of 2017, and I had just quit a tech job in Salt Lake City after burning out hard. My girlfriend and I had broken up a few months earlier. No real drama, just distance and silence until it fell apart. I hadn't spoken to anyone in my family in over a year except for my cousin Dean, who emailed me out of nowhere to let me know that my Uncle Ron, who I hadn't seen since I was 12, had passed away and left behind a small piece of land with a half-dead cabin on it in central Utah, near Fish Lake National Forest. It didn't feel like a big inheritance. Dean said he didn't want anything to do with the place and figured I could use it. I wasn't doing anything else, so I took the key he mailed me and drove out there with a bunch of supplies, figuring it'd be a place to clear my head. I packed canned food, a rifle, a tarp, batteries, and some old gear from college. I told myself I'd fix the roof, get the fireplace going, read some old paperbacks, and just be by myself for a while. The land was isolated, way off the main road, maybe 5 miles from the closest paved highway. I had to drive through 2 narrow dirt trails, both barely wide enough for my truck. The place hadn't been touched in at least 6 or 7 years. The weeds out front came up past my knees, and half the porch had collapsed inward, pulling a rocking chair down with it. I could see animal droppings inside before I even opened the door. Still, the frame was solid. No big holes in the walls or roof that I could see. The place just looked forgotten. There was no power, no running water. I spent the first 2 days sweeping out mouse nests, burning old junk in a barrel outside, and airing it out the best I could. I cleaned out the fireplace and hauled in dry wood from a pile that was still under tarp. A few windows were cracked or broken, but I nailed up wood boards over those. The air smelled like pine needles and dust. I actually started to feel okay for the first time in months. I slept on a camping mattress in one of the back corners of the main room. There was no bedroom, just a large single space with a kitchen area, fireplace, table, and the floor. I left one small window uncovered so I could see out and know when it was morning. It got freezing at night, even in September, but I had a decent sleeping bag and plenty of wool blankets. The first few nights were quiet. I heard coyotes sometimes, the usual wind sounds, cracking branches. I figured I'd hear a lot worse. But on the 4th night, I woke up because I felt like someone was standing close to the wall near the window. Not inside, but outside, just standing. I didn't hear movement, no breathing, no crunching leaves, just this sense that something was there, watching through the thin glass. I laid still and waited for a sound, any sound. Nothing, not even wind. Then after maybe 2 minutes, I heard a faint scrape against the wood panel just under the window. A light dragging noise, not fast, not violent, just enough to make my spine crawl. I grabbed the flashlight beside my sleeping bag and shined it out the window, but all I could see was darkness. The light reflected off the inside of the glass too much for me to make out anything clearly. In the morning, I went out to look around. I saw a weird mark on the wall just beneath the window, a long smudge, like something oily had been dragged along the surface. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or even a bear brushing up against the place. Still, it didn't sit right with me. I started keeping my rifle closer at night. I figured I was just spooked, but 2 nights later, it happened again. I woke up around 3 a.m. for no reason. I just snapped awake. The fire had died down to embers, and the cabin was completely silent. I sat up and listened. Then I heard its slow, shuffling footsteps coming around the side of the cabin. Gravel crunching under weight. Step, pause, step, another pause, then nothing. I held my breath and aimed the rifle at the door, though I didn't expect anything to come through it. The handle didn't move. I just sat there in silence, pointing my rifle at a door that never opened. After 20 minutes of nothing, I crept to the window and looked out. I saw what looked like a figure, far off, maybe 20 yards out, standing at the edge of the trees. Not moving, just a tall shape, slightly hunched, with one arm hanging lower than the other. I stared at it for probably 5 full minutes. I even blinked my flashlight out there. Nothing moved. I turned off the light, waited, then looked again. It was gone. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. The next day, I found what looked like a partial footprint in the dirt by the porch. It was barefoot. That was what messed with me the most. Barefoot and wide. Human-shaped, but the toes looked, I don't know, splayed weird. I don't want to say animal-like, but they didn't look normal. I couldn't stop staring at it. That night, I left the fire burning longer and stacked furniture against the door. I even tied up an old metal pan above the window to make noise if something bumped it. I didn't sleep. Around 2:30, I heard a low, soft grunt, like a person clearing their throat, but deeper, more guttural and too close. Then another long scrape across the wall outside. Then silence again. I stayed frozen until morning. When I finally stepped outside, I saw 3 more of those smudged marks on the walls, and a small pile of what looked like rabbit fur near the firewood stack. That was when I thought, maybe this is what people talk about when they say, skinwalker, something pretending to be human, or something worse. It got into my head. I tried to rationalize it. Probably some deranged hunter or a crazy local off his meds. But something about it felt off. Not just dangerous, wrong. I hiked down to the truck the next day and drove an hour into Richfield to buy game cameras and more ammunition. I didn't tell anyone what I was seeing. I didn't want to deal with disbelief. I just wanted evidence, something I could see. I set up 2 of the cameras in the trees, facing the cabin from different angles. I set one behind the cabin pointing toward the back wall, and the other near the firewood pile. That night, I barely moved. I stayed in my bag, rifle next to me, watching the glow of the dying fire and the strip of moonlight across the floor. Around 1 a.m., I heard one of the pans fall and rattle. I heard footsteps again, slower this time, as if someone was dragging their feet. A soft, steady scratch along the boards. Then a knock, just one knock on the door. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. It didn't knock again. Just one soft thud, then silence. Not even footsteps leaving. In the morning, nothing was out there. Not even tracks. But the back game camera was gone. Just gone, torn off the tree. The other was still there. I checked the SD card and watched the footage. At 12:58 a.m., the footage showed the side of the cabin in dim moonlight. Then movement. Something walked past. But all I could make out was a figure that crawled low to the ground, limbs bent at odd angles, almost like it was folding into itself. Paused under the window, then looked up directly at the camera. The frame froze there. A blurry shot of what looked like a man with no shirt, long hair, and something smeared down one side of his face. Eyes too wide, mouth open. Then the clip ended. That was it. No sound. No other movement. I backed the truck up to the cabin that same day and loaded everything I could. I was done. Whatever this was, animal, human, both, I wasn't staying another night. As I packed, I walked behind the cabin to check the camera that had been torn off. I found it, finally, about 20 feet into the woods. The lens had been shattered, and the mount was bent in half. I picked it up with gloves and tossed it in a bin. Then I saw something else nearby, a tangle of sticks arranged into a strange shape. Not a symbol, not something I could recognize. Just sticks, but purposefully stacked, like a crude cage or nest. Inside were torn pieces of what looked like cloth and the remains of a squirrel, picked clean. I got out of there before the sun even set. Took a long time to stop looking over my shoulder after that. I never went back. I sold the land cheap to some developer through an agent and never checked if they actually built anything there. I don't want to know. People talk about skinwalkers like they're monsters or demons, but I think that's just what fear makes you call the things you don't understand. I think it was a person out there, a sick, broken person, someone who had lost whatever made them human, living off the land in a way we can't imagine, maybe raised out there or hiding for decades. Someone who learned how to move silently. Someone who studied the cabin long before I ever showed up. I don't believe in legends, but I believe in people, and that's what scares me more than anything. It was late October of 2018 when I decided to take some time off work and get away from everything. I just turned 31. Life in Birmingham had been noisy and crowded, and I'd had a rough year. Split up with someone I was seeing, lost my aunt to cancer, and had been working overtime for months. My body felt tired, and my mind wasn't in a good place. I needed space, quiet, and somewhere far from people. I booked a small off-grid cabin in a remote part of Cumbria, about a 4-hour drive north. It was listed on a site that offered isolated rental cabins, nothing fancy, just the basics. No Wi-Fi, no electricity. Just gas, a small wood stove, a solar lamp, and silence. The photos showed a weathered wooden cabin surrounded by woods with a thin path leading through the trees. No neighbors nearby, and the owner said the nearest house was about a mile away. I packed light, just a backpack, some food supplies, a few essentials like my sleeping bag, torch, power bank, and a couple of books. I left early in the morning, drove through cold fog for hours, and reached the edge of the woods around 2:30 in the afternoon. There was a gravel patch to leave the car and a sign nailed to a post pointing into the trees with a hand-painted arrow that read Cabin Path. The walk-in took about 15 minutes. The path was muddy and uneven, and the air smelled like wet leaves. By the time I reached the cabin, my boots were caked in muck. The cabin looked just like the photos, old but solid. The wood was dark and damp from the weather, with moss growing along the bottom walls. The windows were small, one at the front and one on the side, both covered by thin curtains from inside. There was a crooked metal chimney sticking out of the roof, and an old axe stuck in a tree stump by the porch. Inside, it was simple. One room with a small bed, a gas stove, a little table and chair, a shelf with pots and pans, and a pile of chopped firewood stacked against the wall. The back door led into an attached outhouse with a compost toilet. Everything smelled like wood and earth. I opened the windows for a bit, aired the place out, unpacked, and made some tea with the bottled water I'd brought. By 5 o'clock, it was already getting dark. The trees outside closed in, shadows stretched across the floor, and the wind started moving the branches. I lit the small oil lamp and tried reading a book, but the quiet was so heavy it made my ears ring. No cars, no voices, no city noise, just wind and the creaking sounds of the woods. That first night passed quietly. I had trouble sleeping, though, not because of anything scary, just because it was too quiet. I was used to noise, but by the next day, I'd started to settle in. I spent most of my time walking the woods, taking photos of mushrooms and mossy stones, boiling water for tea, sitting outside in a coat and watching the wind. There was no signal, and I kept my phone turned off to save battery. It was on the third day that I first noticed something strange. I'd gone farther down the path past the cabin, deeper into the woods, just walking aimlessly with my thermos and a sandwich in my pocket. After about 25 minutes, I found a second path that forked off to the left. It wasn't part of the main one I'd followed in. It looked older, less walked, overgrown in places. I followed it a little way and noticed the remains of a stone wall half buried in undergrowth. There were old fence posts, some fallen trees, and what looked like the outline of another cabin. But this one was in ruins. Just a partial frame of rotting beams and a collapsed roof. I poked around it for a while. It looked like no one had touched the place in years. Ivy covered most of it. Nearby was a rusted old bucket, a rotted chair with no seat, and broken glass scattered in the dirt. Something about it felt off. Not haunted or anything like that, just like it shouldn't be there, like it had been forgotten for too long. I didn't stay long. I felt uncomfortable for reasons I couldn't explain, so I walked back to my cabin. That evening, it rained, hard. The sound of it hitting the roof filled the cabin, and I spent most of the night trying to sleep through it. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up needing to use the toilet. I pulled on a coat, slipped my boots on, and grabbed the torch. The outhouse was pitch black, and the wind had picked up again. I did what I had to do and was just stepping back outside when I caught a quick flicker of movement through the trees. Something pale, maybe white, down by the edge of the woods in the direction of the path. I stopped, held the light up. Nothing, just trees and rain. I stared for maybe a full minute, listening, but there was no sound. I told myself it was probably the wind or an animal and went back inside. But it stuck in my mind. That flicker, that pale shape. I thought about it all the next day. On the 5th morning, I went back to the ruins out of curiosity. The rain had stopped, but everything was damp. When I got to the collapsed cabin, I noticed something new, footprints in the mud near the edge of the clearing. Not mine, smaller, like a woman's. Boot prints, but not fresh ones. Just recent enough that the rain hadn't erased them fully. There were also marks in the mud where something had been dragged. Long, thin marks like a stick or pole being pulled behind. I looked around for signs of camping or human activity, any sign someone else was out here. Nothing. I didn't like the feeling. I turned back quickly and walked with a fast pace the whole way to my cabin, constantly looking over my shoulder. That night was the worst. I'd eaten early, locked up, and was in bed with my sleeping bag zipped up to my neck when I heard the floorboards creak. Just one, then nothing. I lay still, listening. Another creak, slower this time, not from outside, inside. I sat up fast, grabbed the torch and shone it around the room. Nobody. The lamp still burned low on the table, casting long shadows. I got up and checked the door, still bolted, windows shut. I tried to calm myself. Maybe it was the cabin settling. Maybe a mouse or animal under the floorboards. But I didn't sleep after that. I just sat up for hours back against the wall, torch in hand. And then, around 4 a.m., something knocked on the back door. It wasn't loud, just 3 slow knocks, even spaced out, like the kind you do when you don't want to wake someone, just get their attention. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The outhouse had no lock, just a sliding bolt from the outside. If someone was out there, they'd have to be standing on the small wooden porch under the overhang. There were no lights back there, no reason for anyone to be out here. I sat frozen in place for nearly an hour. No more knocks came. When the sun came up, I opened the front door and stepped outside slowly, walked around to the back. There were footprints in the mud, small boot prints, same size as the ones near the ruined cabin. They led away from the door and disappeared into the trees. I knew I wasn't alone in the woods. I decided to leave. I packed everything, fast. Didn't even eat. Just grabbed my gear and walked out, locking the cabin behind me. My legs didn't stop moving until I reached the car. As soon as I got signal again, I messaged the owner and said I was leaving early. I didn't explain why. I just said something came up. On the way back to Birmingham, I couldn't stop thinking about that woman, because I'm sure it was a woman. I never saw her fully, just flickers. But I started piecing things together, those small footprints, the flicker of pale clothes, the knocking. It all pointed to someone who had been watching, someone who lived or stayed out in those woods. I did some searching online after I got home. I looked up old properties and abandoned cabins near that area. I found one short article from 1994 about a woman who'd gone missing from a nearby village. They said she'd been struggling with her mental health and had vanished into the woods. Her name was June Meredith. Never found. Some said she had a habit of walking for miles alone in the forest. Locals believed she probably died out there. But part of me thinks she didn't. Part of me thinks she's still out there, living off-grid, watching, knocking. I never told anyone about what happened. Sounds too strange. Not supernatural, just too unsettling. Too real. All I know is that I'll never go back to that cabin. And if anyone ever tells me about wanting to get away to some quiet place in the woods, I tell them the truth. Sometimes being alone isn't the scariest thing. Sometimes the scariest thing is realizing you're not. It was late September of 2017 when I decided to leave the noise behind and spend a few weeks deep in the Washington woods, far off any marked trail, where the forest felt thicker and older. I was 31 then. I had saved up some money and quit my office job earlier that year. Everything in the city had started to feel like a constant blur. Cars, phones, screens, people talking all the time. I wanted silence. I wanted to be useful with my hands again, not just my fingertips and a keyboard. I had an idea to build a small off-grid cabin, nothing fancy, just a one-room place I could come back to whenever I wanted peace. I picked a remote patch of land I had access to through a friend's family. It wasn't totally off the map, but close to it. Pine Hollow, they called the area. There were no cabins around, no power lines, and no phone signal. Just tall trees, fallen needles, cold dirt, and the occasional deep growl of wind moving through thick branches. You had to park a half-mile up the slope and hike your gear down. No one else ever came that far, at least not without a reason. I had done my planning. I brought in everything I thought I would need: tools, a big tarp, nails, a bow saw, a hand drill, even a folding cart to haul the wood from where I'd cut it. It took 3 trips from the truck, each one loaded down. The weather was dry when I arrived, but the clouds hung low, already heavy and dark. I could smell the rain coming. I didn't mind. I thought it would give me time to work slower, to focus. The first 2 days were quiet. I set up a simple tarp lean-to over my cot and laid out a cooking area under a second tarp. The clearing I chose was small, tucked between 3 pine trunks, with a shallow ridge behind it that helped block some wind. I marked the perimeter for the cabin, just a 10 by 12 rectangle, enough space for a cot, stove, shelf, and maybe a chair. Nothing more. The rain started on the 3rd night, gentle at first. I had just dug the post holes and put in 2 corner posts. The firewood stayed dry under my makeshift shelter, and I kept warm with instant coffee and canned beans. I could hear the soft patter of water hitting the tarp above me while I lay on my cot. It was peaceful. I thought, this is what I came here for. But by the 5th night, the rain got worse. Poured for hours, relentless, no break. The wind pushed sideways against the tarps and whistled through gaps in the trees. I lay there soaked in my clothes even though I was under cover. Everything felt damp, the blankets, my boots, my pack. The forest took on a different sound at night when it was wet. Branches creaked like old bones. Rain thudded down like footsteps. Every drop hitting the earth was louder in the dark. I woke up to a crash around 2 a.m. A branch had come down nearby, smashing onto the edge of the cooking tarp. I scrambled out of my cot with my flashlight. I was shaking, not from fear but from cold and the shock of being pulled from sleep. The branch had knocked over my water container, which had soaked my firewood. I spent an hour fixing the tarp and moving everything under the lean-to. That was when I noticed the tracks. They were faint in the mud, half washed away by the rain, but they were fresh. Human tracks, boots, wide heel, deep toe prints. Not mine. Too large for me, and I hadn't gone near that part of the clearing. I stared at them for a long time, crouched under my flashlight's narrow beam, trying to tell myself they had to be mine. But they pointed the wrong way, toward my tarp, not away. Someone had come close while I slept. Maybe even stood there, just outside the thin nylon sheet, while I lay curled up and shivering inside. I stayed up the rest of the night, fireless and alert, sitting against a tree with my knife in hand and my flashlight dying in my lap. I didn't leave. I told myself maybe it was just a hiker who had gotten turned around. Maybe it was an old print from before the rain started, and the direction was an illusion. Still, the next morning, I built a second lean-to over the tool area and kept my gear tighter together. I moved everything to face the ridge so I could see if anything came down into the clearing. I was exhausted and shaking most of the day but kept working. Cutting logs, peeling bark, setting corner beams. The work helped. It gave my hands something to do besides tremble. The rain kept falling. Every day, the ground got heavier and thicker. My boots stuck in the muck, and I had to scrape them clean just to walk right. I built up a floor frame using local stone and beams to keep it off the wet soil. The frame creaked when I stepped on it, but it held. By the second week, I had walls up on 3 sides. I didn't hear anything else at night, but I couldn't sleep well either. Something about the quiet wasn't right anymore. It didn't feel like solitude. It felt watched. I stopped boiling water after dark. I stopped using the lanterns. I just sat with the rain, letting it tap across the roofline like fingers. Then the wire went missing. I had a coil of steel wire I was using to bind corners and hang hooks. I kept it in a canvas tool bag under the tarp. It was gone one morning. I searched the entire camp. Nothing. No tracks this time. Just a patch of disturbed mud near the back of the clearing, like something or someone had stood there again. I told myself an animal took it. Raccoon, maybe. But why would a raccoon take wire? The thought felt forced. I started keeping my knife on me at all times, even when I went to piss. My axe I set beside my cot. At night, I used no light, just sat and listened. When the wind died and the rain came straight down, it sounded like someone walking. When the wind picked up and blew hard through the trees, I could swear I heard breathing that wasn't mine. I should have packed up then, but the cabin was nearly done. The roof was up. I had one wall left to insulate. I kept telling myself I was just being paranoid. Too much alone time, too much rain. Maybe I'd imagined the prints. Maybe I'd misplaced the wire. Maybe I needed to finish this one thing, just this one thing, and then I could go. The last night, the rain stopped completely. For the first time in days, the sky cleared up. I heard no drops, no wind, just the creak of trees and the sound of wet branches settling. It was worse than the storm. The quiet made every sound louder. Twigs snapping, water dripping, a distant groan of wood bending. I lay on my cot under the cabin roof for the first time. No tarp now, just rafters and the smell of wet pine. I heard something walking. Started soft like a shuffle, maybe 20 feet out. Then it came closer, slow, careful. One step, then a pause. Then another. Then a longer pause. It wasn't rushing. It wasn't lost. It knew where it was going. I gripped the knife in my sleeping bag. I held my breath. The steps stopped just outside the unfinished wall. I could see through the gap in the boards. Nothing there, just black woods. Then something moved, slow, just a shadow crossing between trees.
No flashlight. No noise. No breath.
I stayed awake the rest of the night. When the sun finally broke over the ridge, I packed everything I could carry into my canvas duffel and left the rest behind. I didn't bother covering the gear. I didn't even fold the tarp. I hiked out fast, never looking back. My heart was pounding the whole time, every snapping branch sounding like someone behind me. I made it to the truck by noon. The windows were fogged from the inside. I wiped them off and climbed in. My boots were still caked in drying mud. The rearview mirror showed nothing but trees. No one had followed, but I still drove down the mountain like something was chasing me. I never went back to Pine Hollow. The cabin's probably still there, half finished, its roof sinking in under the weight of 2 years of rain. Maybe someone else found it. Maybe they stayed a night. I never told anyone what happened. When people asked why I gave up on the build, I just said the weather got to me. But it wasn't the weather. It was that feeling, something off, something watching, something just close enough to touch but never showing its face. I don't think it wanted to hurt me. I think it just didn't want me there. I still don't know what it was. Could have been someone living off-grid. Could have been a hunter. Could have been some sick guy who didn't like people in his woods. All I know is I've never heard the sound of rain the same way again. Not without looking over my shoulder. Not without thinking about those footprints and the wire that never turned up. And that one silent night in the cabin, when the rain finally stopped and the forest got quiet, too quiet. It was late September of 2016, and I had just turned 34 a couple of weeks earlier. I'd been living in a small town called Jasper Creek, up in northern Minnesota, not far from the Canadian border. The town wasn't much, just a couple thousand people, scattered houses, Pine trees taller than anything in the city, and the same quiet roads I'd driven since I was a teenager. Life slowed down out here. You notice the cold quicker, the silence deeper, and when something feels off, it cuts right through everything. My neighbor, Scott Neely, had lived 2 houses down from me for around 4 years. He was a state trooper, the kind who didn't say much, always kept his yard tidy, and left early in the mornings in that beat-up gray Ford Explorer. He was about 40, tall, built like a linebacker, and not the type you'd ever expect to joke around with. I only knew him through waves and short greetings while grabbing the mail or mowing the lawn. He didn't have a wife or any kids, just a German shepherd named Rocco that barked like hell at anything that moved past the fence. One Friday evening that fall, I was fixing the hinges on my back gate when Scott walked over. That alone surprised me. He never came over to talk, but he just stood there for a second, then mentioned he was heading to his family's old cabin upstate for a few days, a few miles past a place called Winlow Ridge. He said he could use help doing some repairs, roof patching, moving some old lumber, clearing brush. He mentioned he'd pay me for the help and offered to drive. I didn't have much going on that weekend. I'd been laid off from a warehouse job the month before, and my unemployment checks weren't stretching too far. I figured a few days in the woods doing some grunt work and getting paid for it wouldn't be the worst way to spend the time. Plus, the idea of doing something useful again felt good. I told him I was in. We left early the next morning. I threw some clothes into my old duffel, tossed in a few cans of soup and a flashlight, and met him in front of his place just after 6. His dog wasn't coming. He left it with a neighbor. The drive was long. We passed endless tree lines, stretches of road with no signs, no cell signal, and barely any cars. The silence in the truck was awkward at first, but eventually, I got used to it. He had a thermos of black coffee and didn't speak much beyond saying the cabin was built by his grandfather in the 1950s. After about 4 hours of driving, the paved road turned into gravel, and the gravel turned into dirt. Branches brushed against the truck like fingers, and everything around us felt like it hadn't been touched in decades. Finally, we reached it. A small, faded log cabin tucked in the trees, a couple 100 feet off a narrow trail. No other cabins nearby, no lake, just deep woods in every direction. The roof had a sag in it, the front steps were warped, and moss crept up the walls. Inside was dusty, cramped, and smelled like old pine and mildew. There were 2 small bedrooms, a short hallway, and a kitchen that hadn't seen a fridge in years. A wood stove sat in the corner. There was no electricity, no running water. Just a hand pump out back and a cracked lantern on the shelf. Scott showed me around without saying much, then handed me a hammer and said we'd start on the roof first. That first day was just work. We pulled off old shingles, replaced rotted boards, and nailed down tar paper. He didn't say much while we worked, and I didn't ask questions. When the sun dropped, we sat by a small fire outside and ate canned beans straight from the tin. I couldn't shake the silence of the place. There were no birds, no wind, nothing. Just that constant stillness that pressed on your ears. The second day, something felt different. I woke up before sunrise, and Scott was already outside. He was sitting in a camp chair, facing the woods, rifle across his lap like he'd been out there for hours. He didn't even look at me when I came out, just stood up, said we had a lot to do, and walked toward the back of the cabin where we'd started clearing brush. By late afternoon, the air started to shift. It wasn't just cold, it was biting. The sky darkened faster than I expected, even for fall, and the wind that picked up had that hollow sound to it, like it was moving through something abandoned. I was carrying a bundle of branches to the fire pit when I saw something that made me stop. About 50 feet into the trees, there was a stack of wood, not chopped firewood, but long, freshly cut logs, stacked neatly in a pyramid. Clean cuts.
No bark.
Not old either. I hadn't noticed them before, and I'd passed that area twice. I asked Scott about it, and he paused for a second longer than he should have. Then he just said, "Old logging trail. Might be from back then, but the cuts were too fresh. That wood was not from the 1950s. That night I couldn't sleep. The cot in the spare room creaked with every shift, and the wind banged something against the back wall. I got up to pee around 2, stepped outside, and nearly tripped on something in the dirt. A metal trap, half buried, rusted, but set. My heart kicked hard in my chest. I didn't say anything to Scott the next morning, but I was starting to feel uneasy. Then, on the third night, things really turned. We spent most of that day clearing debris from an old shed near the back of the cabin. It was half collapsed and full of broken tools, rusted cans, and something that looked like old animal bones. Around dusk, we heard the sound of an engine in the distance. Scott froze. I looked at him and waited, but he didn't move, just stared out toward the trees. Then the sound stopped.
No headlights.
No crunch of gravel, just silence again. He went inside and didn't come out for hours. I sat by the fire alone until I got too cold and went in. The front door was locked. I knocked lightly, nothing. After a minute, it clicked open. He was standing there, rifle in hand, face pale. He told me to sleep with the door shut that night. That was all he said. I stayed awake most of that night, staring at the ceiling, heart racing at every creak and thump. Sometime after 3 a.m., I heard footsteps outside, heavy ones, slow, crunching on the gravel, then brushing past the side of the cabin. I reached for my flashlight, didn't turn it on, just listened. The steps circled the cabin. Once, twice, then they stopped. Something scratched at the window just once. Then it was gone. I never slept, and I didn't tell Scott what I heard. But that morning I was done. I told him I needed to head back. He didn't argue, just nodded, packed up his stuff, and we left without a word. But before we pulled out, I walked once more toward the back of the cabin, near that stack of logs. It was gone. Not a single piece left. No drag marks, no disturbed ground. Just cleared like it was never there. I sat quiet the whole ride home. I kept looking at Scott's hands on the wheel, steady, calm, like he wasn't bothered. But I was. Something had happened out there, something he wasn't telling me. Whether it was someone watching us or him hiding something, I don't know. But I started looking into him after we got back. Turns out, he'd inherited that cabin after his older brother died in 2009. His brother had been a deputy in Duluth. The death was ruled a suicide. But there were rumors. Something about a woman going missing near Winlow Ridge, search parties turning up nothing, and the family going quiet about it. I stopped seeing Scott much after that. He got transferred downstate the next spring, sold the house, moved out without saying goodbye. That cabin still haunts me, not in some dreamlike ghost story way, but in the way a cold silence stays in your bones long after you leave a place. I still think about those footsteps, the missing wood, the traps buried around the trees, and the look in his eyes when he stood in that doorway, rifle in hand, like he was waiting for something he didn't want me to see. I don't talk about it to anyone, because I don't even know what I'd say. Nothing happened, not really, but something was there. Something was wrong, and whatever it was, Scott had seen it before. I was 34 when I decided to take a break from everything and spend a weekend alone at a small cabin my uncle used to own in northern Idaho. He had passed a couple of years ago, and the place had been sitting there unused ever since. The property was still in the family, but no one really went up there anymore. It sat deep in the woods, off a narrow service road that barely got plowed in the winter. It was early October 2021, and the days were still mild, but the nights were starting to get cold. I needed some time away. The job had been killing me, Deadlines, late nights, no personal time. I just ended a long-term relationship a month before. I hadn't really processed any of it. So I figured I'd drive up there, clear my head, get away from phones and noise and everything else. Just trees, wind, and the smell of pine. I drove up on a Friday morning from Coeur d'Alene. Took about 3 hours. The last stretch of road was rough, gravel and dirt with old tire ruts full of dried mud. Trees pressed in on both sides. There were no signs, no houses, nothing. I had to use a printed map since the signal dropped an hour before I got there. When I finally saw the turnoff that led to the cabin, it was almost hidden behind overgrown bushes and some fallen branches. I parked the truck at the edge of the clearing and just sat for a minute. The place looked almost exactly how I remembered it as a teenager. A single-story log cabin with a green metal roof, one chimney, and a small porch sagging at one corner. A shed stood off to the side, partly covered in creeping moss. I got out and stretched. The air smelled clean, sharp with the scent of wet leaves and cold sap. I opened up the cabin, and it creaked like it hadn't been touched in years. Inside, it was dark and cool. Dust covered everything. There was no power, no running water. Just a wood stove, an old twin bed, a small table, and a few chairs. I dropped my backpack on the bed and got to work opening the shutters and sweeping the place out. That first day was simple. I gathered firewood, checked the shed, which still had some old tools and canned food, and walked around the property. No one for miles. The silence was almost too much after living in the city so long. I made a fire in the stove that night and ate from a can of chili I warmed over it. I read by flashlight until I got tired and then went to bed. The second day, Saturday, started off fine. I woke up to a cold breeze coming through the cracks in the wall. The fire had gone out in the night, and my breath fogged in the air. I boiled some instant coffee over the fire and took a walk deeper into the woods. There was a dry creek bed I remembered as a kid, and I found it again. The rocks were still there, smooth and white. I sat for a while and just listened. That afternoon, I started noticing something weird. When I got back to the cabin, I found my hatchet lying on the porch. I'd left it stuck in a tree stump about 20 feet away. I assumed maybe it had fallen or rolled somehow, though it didn't make much sense. Still, I brushed it off. Animals could have moved it. Wind, maybe. That night, something woke me up. I didn't hear a sound exactly, just a sense that something was off. I sat up in bed and looked toward the door. The fire had burned low again, casting weird flickering shadows on the ceiling. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the room. Nothing. But then I noticed the front door was slightly open. I knew I had locked it. It had one of those thick iron latches that you had to slide in place from the inside. I got up and checked it. The latch was still locked, but the door had pulled slightly away from the frame like it had been forced. There were scratches on the edge. 3 deep ones, low to the ground, like something had pried at it. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in the chair with my flashlight, facing the door, listening. I never heard anything else. No footsteps, no animal sounds, just wind and creaking wood. The next morning, Sunday, I found boot prints outside the cabin. Big ones. They circled the building once, then disappeared into the woods. I followed them for a little bit but lost them after 50 feet. The ground was soft and muddy in some places, so the prints were clear. Definitely a man's boots. Heavy like work boots. The thing was, I hadn't seen anyone else up here.
No vehicles, no smuka frum distant fires, no buisses, no trails.
There was no reason for someone to be walking around the middle of nowhere in the middle of the night. I packed my things that morning, but I kept telling myself I was overreacting. It's a cabin in the woods, I thought. Maybe someone else used to hunt nearby. Maybe an old drifter passed through. Still, I kept my hunting knife on me the rest of the day and moved more cautiously. I decided to stay one last night, but I made sure everything was locked up tight. I even moved a heavy table in front of the door and stuck a few pans on top of it so I'd hear if it moved. I kept the fire going low and stayed up late. I heard small noises outside around midnight. A crack, like a twig snapping, then nothing, then again a little closer. I sat there, heart pounding, gripping the flashlight and my knife. The pans never rattled, and the door stayed shut. Eventually, I dozed off in the chair. I woke up at dawn and found something that made my stomach sink. Right outside the back window, there were fresh scratch marks. Long ones, deep in the wood, dragging down the siding. Too high for an animal, way too deliberate. I checked the back of the shed too, and found the door slightly ajar. Inside, one of the rusted shovels was missing. That was it for me. I threw my stuff into my bag and headed for the truck. The engine started slow, but it came alive. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was halfway back to town and got a signal on my phone. I checked for news or reports of anyone missing or wanted in the area. Nothing. Just me and some invisible stranger in the woods. I told my cousin about it later. He's the one managing the land now. He went up there the next week to check things out. He called me after and said the place looked undisturbed.
No prints. No scratch marks.
He thought maybe I had imagined most of it. I didn't argue, but I know what I saw. I remember how it felt. Something or someone was out there watching me, waiting. I don't go into the woods alone anymore, not even for a walk. And I sure as hell won't ever sleep in that cabin again. Because that place isn't empty. Not really. It just pretends to be. I was 34 the summer I decided to stay alone in a cabin deep in northern Idaho. It was late August 2016. I had just left my job in Seattle and wanted a break from everything. People, screens, traffic, the noise. I found a place through a guy I'd met years ago when I did a short trail guide course in Montana. He owned some land near Priest Lake, far enough from anything that you couldn't hear a car or see a streetlight at night. He let me use his old hunting cabin for a couple weeks, just handed me the keys and gave me a map that he scribbled on with pen, showing a few trails and streams nearby. No cell signal, no internet, no electricity, just a small solar setup to run lights and charge a flashlight. I brought what I needed: dry food, propane, a rifle, and a big cooler I loaded with ice and fresh stuff I planned to eat in the first few days. The drive up took me nearly 8 hours. The last part was rough. Gravel roads that narrowed into tight paths, branches scraping the truck, no road signs. Just memory and the hand-drawn map. The final mile I had to do on foot with my backpack after the trail turned too steep and washed out from my truck. When I reached the cabin, it looked like it hadn't been touched in a while, with logs gone gray, moss climbing halfway up the walls, the roof dark with pine needles. It was small, maybe 16 by 20 feet. One room, a wood stove, a cot, a wooden table, and an outhouse a short walk downhill. There was a stream about 40 yards behind the cabin, running clear and cold. No other cabins nearby, just forest, thick, quiet forest. The first couple of days were what I expected. I woke up at dawn, cooked oatmeal or eggs if the ice was still holding, walked the trails, took notes on birds and trees, and read books I brought. By day 3, I started settling into the silence. I didn't see anyone, not even from a distance. There weren't even planes flying overhead. Just wind and the occasional crunch of deer or maybe elk walking through the woods. But on the 4th day, I noticed something strange. I was walking one of the old trails about a mile from the cabin when I saw boot prints in the dirt. They weren't mine. I hadn't walked that section before, and these looked fresh. They were big, wider than my feet, and went off the trail toward a dense patch of forest. I stopped and looked around. Didn't see anyone, didn't hear anything. It was weird, but not enough to make me worried. Could have been a hunter or someone from farther up the mountain. I kept walking but didn't go down the path the prince had followed. That night, I was reading inside the cabin when I thought I heard something outside. Just a crack of wood. A snap. Not too loud. Could have been a tree limb falling. But it felt close, too close. I turned off the solar lantern and just listened. Nothing. I sat still for a long time. My ears started playing tricks on me, making me think I heard footsteps or breathing, but it was probably just the wind shifting through the trees. The next morning, I stepped outside and noticed something I hadn't seen before. A small pile of rocks stacked on a tree stump about 30 feet from the cabin. 5 smooth stones balanced in a little tower that hadn't been there the day before. I was sure of it. I walked over and looked at it. The rocks weren't from the nearby stream. These were dry and lighter colored, like river rocks. Not local. Someone had placed them there carefully. I knocked them over. Then I circled the cabin, looking for any sign someone had been close during the night. Nothing obvious, no tracks, no broken branches. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I heard the wind pick up or a small thump on the roof from a falling pine cone, I jerked awake. I started keeping the rifle loaded and within reach. 2 days later, I went back down the trail where I'd seen the boot prints. I wanted to figure out where they led. About half a mile in, I found a tree with some bark peeled off at shoulder height. At first I thought it might be a bear, but it looked like it was cut with a knife. Clean slices. Below it, someone had left another little stack of rocks. I kicked this one apart too. I was starting to feel uneasy. I was deep in the woods with no communication, no backup. The guy who owned the place lived hours away, and I had no idea who was leaving these signs. That night it rained hard. Wind slammed the trees around and made the cabin groan. The rain made it harder to hear anything outside, and that made me feel more exposed. I kept the lantern off and sat in the dark for hours. I didn't sleep at all. When the rain finally let up, around dawn, I stepped outside and saw something that made my chest tighten. A set of wet boot prints on the steps of the cabin. They came from the woods and stopped just outside the door. No prints going back. Whoever it was had come right up to the cabin during the storm and stood there, probably listening. Maybe even watching through the window. I checked the perimeter, but the wet ground didn't hold the prints beyond the porch. I couldn't tell which direction the person went. I stayed close to the cabin that day, rifle slung over my shoulder every time I moved. I started to notice how exposed the windows were, how thin the wooden door felt, how alone I really was. That night, I stacked firewood against the inside of the door and blocked the window with a blanket. I kept my boots on and the backpack half-packed in case I had to run. I barely blinked. Sometime after midnight, I heard a soft scraping sound. Then a thud came from the roof. I froze. The roof wasn't high, maybe 9 feet at the peak. Someone could climb up if they really wanted to. I stood there, holding the rifle, breathing through my nose, trying not to panic. The sound came again, something sliding or shifting above me. Then silence. I didn't sleep again. In the morning, I stepped outside and looked up. On the roof, near the edge, there was something sitting there. Pair of boots, muddy, worn, sitting side by side as if someone had left them there on purpose. I didn't touch them. I just backed away, grabbed my bag, and walked down the trail. I didn't care about the rest of the food or the gear I left behind. I just wanted to get out. The trail felt longer than I remembered. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. When I got back to the truck, it had been moved. It was still there, but it had been rolled forward about 10 feet. The dirt showed the marks clearly. My gut twisted. I got in, locked the doors, and drove until I was back in cell range. I didn't stop until I hit Sandpoint, a good 100 miles away. I called the guy who owned the cabin and told him what happened. He didn't sound surprised. He said something like, "Yeah, those woods are pretty quiet, but They've got their own thing going on. I didn't ask what he meant. I never went back. A month later, I saw a news story out of that area. Some hikers found a campsite deep in the forest. It had tarps, canned food, old boots, and a pile of notebooks filled with strange writing. No one knew who it belonged to. Some people said it was a hermit. Others said it looked more like someone watching the trails. I knew what I'd seen, and I knew someone had been watching me. I still think about it sometimes, especially when I'm out in the woods again. I haven't done a solo trip since. I still camp, but only with people I trust, and never without backup. That cabin taught me something I won't forget. Real fear doesn't need ghosts, just silence, distance, and someone out there who wants to be seen only when you're most alone.